The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 26, verses 59 to 75. Now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. At the last came 2 false witnesses, and said, This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose and said unto him, Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But Jesus held his peace. And the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus saith unto him, Thou hast said. Nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. What think ye? They answered and said, He is guilty of death. Then did they spit in his face and buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee? Now Peter sat without in the palace, and a damsel came unto him, saying, Thou also wast with Jesus of Galilee. But he denied before them all, saying, I know not what thou sayest. And when he was gone out into the porch, another maid saw him, and said unto them that were there, This fellow was also with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied with an oath, I do not know the man. And after a while came unto him they that stood by, and said to Peter, Surely thou also art one of them, for thy speech bewrayeth thee. Then began he to curse and to swear, saying, I know not the man. And immediately the cock crew. And Peter remembered the word of Jesus, which said unto him, Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out and wept bitterly. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. In yesterday's reading, we were witness to Jesus being taken captive by the armed brigade or militia sent by the Sanhedrin and the chief priests, led by Judas to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Judas knew Jesus was likely to be. After some brief attempts to defend Jesus, his disciples fled. And here we have now Jesus in the palace of the high priest. We know from the end of yesterday's reading that Peter, after fleeing, backtracked and from a distance followed the brigade and has made his way into the palace and is sitting with the servants. Now, this would be essentially a hearing to decide on blasphemy and potentially capital punishment. Of course, they want to destroy Jesus, but they're trying to keep up some semblance of law. This should be held during the daytime. It's still night. This evil mockery of a trial is being held in darkness. The chief priests and elders and the council are seeking witnesses against Jesus. They're looking for 2 or more witnesses that can independently repeat things that he has said that is clear blasphemy and would then entail a clear death sentence. In earlier times, they would have been able to conduct that death sentence themselves by stoning the guilty party to death, but now under the Roman rule, they have given up the right to capital punishment, that they would hand over the person to the Roman authorities to enact the capital punishment. Interestingly, though, they cannot find two false witnesses that will agree. They have, I guess, individuals coming in independently so they can't hear each other and saying words that they remember from the lips of Jesus, unless they've been bribed, but for some reason they are confused, confounded. And finally, they do have two witnesses that can vaguely tell the same falsehood. They're either lying or they're misremembering, and they say, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." And here they're either completely misinterpreting what Jesus said to his disciples after they left the temple a few days earlier, when the disciples were admiring the temple, and Jesus said to them that one day there would not be one stone left upon another. Jesus' prophecy of the fall of the temple, which occurred in AD 70. There's also, though, a quotation from Jesus, which is reported in the Gospel of John, where he's actually visiting the temple in an earlier time and having a confrontation with the religious authorities there. And he says something along the lines of, "Destroy this temple and it will be risen in 3 days." And he was referring to his body, the temple of his holy body, that he would be able to rise from the dead within 3 days. But that's all gotten terribly confused here. But there's two false witnesses are at least able to say something along the same lines, and the high priest Caiaphas arises and says to Jesus, "Do you answer nothing? What is it that these witnesses are bringing against you?" But we hear that Jesus says nothing in reply. He holds his peace. His dignity, both in his human form and his divine form, rise well above this tawdry sham of a trial. And I think in their desperation, given that really the evidence is certainly not enough for a capital crime, even if someone were to boast that they could build a temple in 3 days, it would not really amount to blasphemy or a capital crime. The high priest Caiaphas is actually quite crafty here, and essentially demands of Jesus to swear by God the Father whether or not he is the Christ. And there's really no way round this. And apparently in these trials with the Sanhedrin, silence was not really an option. Silence was essentially a signal of guilt. And if Jesus were to reply that, "Yes, I am Christ, the Son of God," then, given that they don't believe him, they would convict him of blasphemy. If he denies being the Son of God, then they would convict him of misleading the people, because many of the people are convinced that he is the Messiah. So there's no easy answer here, and in any case he's being asked to swear by God the Father, and here in verse 64, Jesus, almost for the first time in his ministry, publicly announces his being the Messiah. In the Gospel of Mark, his reply is much clearer. He says, "I am." Here in Matthew, I do feel like there is still some vagueness. He says, when asked, "Is he the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" he says, "You have said, thou hast said." And all of the commentators agree that this means yes. I do feel, though, that there is some slight difference, particularly because the next word he says is "nevertheless," where he goes on to say that he will be sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven, and refers to himself as the Son of Man, not the Son of God. So I think this answer is actually quite complex. Commentators want to make it simpler, but I think there's some nuances here. He is somehow, Jesus, determined to refer to himself as the Son of Man, even in these last desperate hours. But he does reply with the phrase, "Thou hast said." And we do have this colloquial phrase in English. If someone asks us a question, we can say, "You said it," which is a way to say absolutely, and nevertheless does have a more archaic meaning of at the same time, rather than sort of nonetheless. So one can sort of read it in that straightforward way, but I do wonder if there's something more nuanced here. It's academic though, because the answer is taken as a yes, and this is seen as clear blasphemy. Caiaphas rents his clothes, which apparently was forbidden for the high priest to do, except under extreme duress. But here the blasphemy is so shocking to him, at least he wants to show it to be so shocking, that he tears his tunic and says, "He has spoken blasphemy. We do not have any need of witnesses. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And the council and the high priests and the chief priests and elders around answer and say, "He is guilty of death." And that is the signal for the immediate abuse of Jesus. Now, in the Gospel of, I believe it's the Gospel of John, but I may be misremembering, it may be in Luke, but we'll see in the further on in the Gospel year. But in one or both of those Gospels, I think there is a physical blow given to Jesus before even any verdict. But here in Mark and in Matthew, this physical abuse of Jesus is held off until he is condemned to death. Many of the council and of the elders will know in their hearts that they have committed an evil act, because many of them in their hearts will know that they are in the presence of the Divine One. But peer pressure, as I explained at length in the equivalent commentary from the passage in Mark, peer pressure is the most corrosive acid, more corrosive than hydrochloric or sulfuric or nitric acid. It corrodes our very soul, it withers our courage, it turns our guts to water. Peer pressure, the pressure of a group, the fear of being at odds with a group, and they just go along with this wicked act. And then probably the officials or some of the guard that brought Jesus captive, who are standing probably by him, start to physically assault him. They spit in his face, which is the grossest form of disrespect. They punch him. To buffet is to punch. Others strike him with the palms of their hands. And he's probably being attacked here by over a dozen people. He won't be able to see from whom the blows are landing, and they say in a mocking way, "Prophesy unto us, Christ, who is he that strikes thee?" For every Christian who reads these verses, it is a misery to have to read this. It is galling to the soul to see the Son of God, Jesus, our shepherd, whom we love, so mistreated. I know for myself, every time I read the latter part of any of the Gospels, where we start to come to the final essentially 24 hours of the earthly life of Jesus, I always find myself subconsciously willing the story to be different, willing for the chief priests and Sanhedrin to allow their humanity and their religious love come to the surface and push away their zealotry, push away their pride, push away their false belief in a rigid letter of law, and to just accept this clear, revolutionary message of the gospel from the Son of Man, the Son of God, and for paradise to start to reign on earth in 30 AD. But it never is the case. It's always, every time I read the Gospels, the same miserable period. This hideous mockery of a trial after the betrayal, the desertion and denials of the disciples, the only glimmer really being the love and honor shown to Jesus from those women that accompanied the disciples during the ministry of Christ, and we'll come to that in the next few readings. But of course, the pain that we have as Christians in reading these verses is finally ameliorated by the resurrection, by the glorious appearance of Christ to Mary Magdalene, to the disciples, and his message of hope to them before his ascension. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. We'll leave this awful scene of Jesus being attacked by these wicked men, these fools. As one commentator pointed out, they will all be seeing Jesus again at some later time in a very uncomfortable, deeply uncomfortable setting. Now, these last few verses are equally upsetting and just disappointing. I've been defending Peter so often against I think sometimes the too harsh words of the commentators, but there's no defending Peter here. We see Peter descend to a very great depth. Peter, the lead disciple, the first disciple, the spokesman for the disciples, the rock, given the keys to the kingdom of heaven by Jesus, beloved by Jesus, forgiven by Jesus on so many occasions when he was slow to understand or foolish. But here, I think bravely, absolutely bravely entering the palace, but his courage has left him and he is stuck in the palace. He's held by love, he's repelled by fear. If he just had an ounce more courage, perhaps he would be wrestling some of those wicked men away from Jesus and screaming for justice, would himself be arrested and possibly condemned to death, but he would die a hero's death. But that ounce of courage is not to be had, but his love is so deep, he can't leave Jesus. And it's a hideous paralysis. And he's shaken out of this paralysis by a challenge from a young woman, either a maidservant or maybe one of the young women associated with the men in the Sanhedrin, but directly combating Peter as he sits with the servants. You were with Jesus of Galilee. You're one of that band that used to hang around with Jesus of Galilee. He instantly denies before that woman, because you could imagine heads would swing round, people would be staring at him. And he says, I know not what thou sayest. So he denies this first time by claiming he doesn't understand what she means. And he scurries away, there's no other word for it. He leaves and goes into another part of the palace. Just a word here of the geography of the palace. People believe that Peter was actually able to see the trial, that the palace would have had a raised section where that trial would have taken place, but then there would be a sort of a lower sort of hall surrounding it where servants would be sitting around fires to warm themselves. So Peter, although some distance from Jesus and the so-called trial, would have been able to witness. But now he goes a bit further away, out through an archway, and a different young woman sees him and says to people that are around, oh yes, this man, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. Again, that awful feeling that we all know if we are the unwanted subject of scrutiny from a group, particularly if it's unfriendly. He instantly, his fear, driving all love, all dignity, all comradeship, all courage away. He denies also this time with an oath. He swears, I swear by God I do not know the man. That's a much stronger denial than before. And a little while later, I'm sure he's being looked at this whole time. He must be extraordinarily uncomfortable. People are standing around and they say to him, definitely you're one of those. Your speech bewrayeth thee. And bewray, a very, very ancient word, but essentially meaning that it gives him away, or it convinces them of the case. Because the Galilean tongue apparently was very crude to the Judean ear. There were many syllable sounds that the Galileans pronounced very similarly, so it was a strong, strong accent. And this time Peter not only swears, but he curses. So now he's swearing by God, but he's also cursing, possibly himself. But he's saying in the strongest possible terms that he does not know the man Jesus Christ. And this third hideous denial, where Peter has fallen to an extraordinary depth. The cock crows. It must be pre-dawn, perhaps something like 4 or 5 in the morning. A cock crows, awakening Peter from this nightmare. It's almost like something from Kafka. Just an existential nightmare where a person is trapped. Here, Peter trapped between love and fear. Fear driving love from his heart, from his actions, but the cock crows and he remembers what Jesus said to him in the Mount of Olives. Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me 3 times. And it's almost like Peter is awoken from a spell. And he just bravely, directly walks out of the palace. And these last 3 words, we can only begin to imagine this depth of despair. I think it may almost be impossible to imagine. Can you imagine being in the company of the Son of God for a year or more, his most trusted companion, his closest companion, and having sort of a love of admiration and of worship for this divine figure, and then in a time of madness 2, 3 times firstly in a disingenuous way, secondly by vowing essentially an oath and committing perjury, and thirdly by just crudely cursing, denying that you ever knew that person that you loved. And in doing so, fulfilling a prediction from that very divine figure. We cannot imagine that depth of despair. And wept bitterly. And in his heart Peter would forever weep bitterly. He would never be the same person after this. And as some commentators, I think, very astutely point out, all four Gospels share this story of Peter's denial, even the Gospel of Mark, which actually is very explicit about this whole set of denials from essentially the witness of Peter himself. So we have to honor Peter in not hiding his weakness or trying to wriggle out of it. He's very honest about the depths to which he fell. And perhaps this is some profound lesson that we are all in danger of falling away from Christ, even Peter who fell so far. But even if we start to fall, we can climb back, and Jesus will forgive us. Jesus will always love and forgive us if we climb back in our faith and our love.